Hi, Susan.
It's actually me, Art. It's Melissa.
Well, that's good. Well, I'm looking forward to this. I'm working with Shawn on other projects,
Oh, yes.
and so it's good to catch up and see what's happening. Sorry I missed the last one. There are so many of these meetings now, it's hard to judge, you know.
No, not a problem.
Very
Not a
hard.
problem at all.
All right. Well, I'm going to be lurking in the background.
Sounds great.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Can you
Hello?
see me?
I can see you, but you're like, I can see your mouth and maybe your glasses. You gotta zoom out.
Ah, there we go.
Hello?
There you go. Hello.
This is Gloria. Loma has to.
Oh, hi, Gloria. This is Melissa Brott. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Great. I'm so glad that we're finally able to connect and you can join us today.
Exactly. Yes. I was looking forward to the workshop and just didn't work out that we were able to connect right away.
I
So it's
know.
good.
Well, this virus has
And we're
caused.
still having problems with our computers and phone lines.
Oh, really? Are you still working remotely?
Mhm. Yes. Yeah.
Good. Hey,
Hi,
Shawn.
Get
Melissa.
some work
How are
done.
you?
Good. Let me co-host here.
Hey Matt, how are you?
Just fine. Who is this?
Shawn Evans. We've met at the last couple ATOM conferences.
Yeah. I recognized you the last meeting too, so it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
The background music isn't too loud, is it?
I don't hear it at all.
No.
That's exactly what I needed.
What are you listening to?
Garbage.
The band, or you're criticizing your musical selection?
No, the band.
Nice.
I haven't listened to garbage in quite some time.
Are they still together?
No, well, I guess they are. I follow her on Twitter and
Uh-huh.
Shirley Manson, and I guess they still play together, but they're like, they're not producing anything or touring.
Right.
Yeah, so still good though. Every once in a while, I see a live performance. Man, she still got it.
What was their big hit?
Huh?
What was their big hit?
Oh Lord, there's like 2 or 3 albums full of it. Yeah, like every one of their songs I like. So
Uh-huh. Melissa, do you want me to test it out?
Yeah, you're welcome to. Sure.
All right, everybody gets a sneak peek.
That's right. Looks great. Looks perfect.
All right.
I have a question. This is Gloria.
Sure.
I'm not able to get on Zoom right now. So is it a issue or a problem with being on the phone, cell phone?
No, are you able to see the presentation at all, or are you just calling in on the phone?
I'm just calling in.
Um,
Let me see if I can, I don't know if I can get into that.
I think it'll be fine.
I mean, it'll be fine. And afterwards, we'll have a copy of Shawn's PowerPoint that we can always send. And then we also record the webinar. So, you can go back and look at the actual images or anything, but it'll be fine.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's why I was just wondering if the session would encompass having to look at documents.
Mm-hmm.
Not today. Well, it's another beautiful day in Santa Fe.
Looks nice here, but it's
Nice.
cold.
It's windy. There's like, I don't know, 50-mile-per-hour gust at my house today. It's a very
Oh,
windy
yeah.
day.
If you get out in the sun, it's all right, but
Yeah.
inside the house, it's a little chilly.
Mm-hmm.
Are you guys close to one another?
Yeah, you're like, what, 6 miles south of me?
Maybe, yeah. Because you're in Guthrie, right? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, we are close to each other.
Hey, Sam.
everyone.
Hey, Dee.
Hey, Sam.
How is everyone?
Good. How are you today?
Good, busy.
Yeah.
This whole world didn't slow down for me at all. So
I get it.
Some days I wish it would slow down for me a little bit.
I know.
yeah, if you can see on my table behind me, I have all these like projects and house things and all these things I could never get to do. And I thought, all right, I'm gonna get through a lot of things, and it just keeps piling up, and now we don't have anywhere to eat. So
Okay, let's see. We got about 14 people on. We'll give it just another minute or two, and then we'll get started.
It's like watching the Brady Bunch intro.
That's true. I'm just now starting to get used to using Zoom and being on video all the time. It's kind of weird.
I had a meeting yesterday with the USDA in Nebraska, and I don't know what they were using, but it was their own kind of webinar deal. I had to call in on my phone and then had the camera and everything with the laptop. It was very weird.
Hmm.
I don't know why they did it that way. It's like, why don't you just be like everybody else?
Right? Right.
Be right back.
Good morning.
Good morning, Lillian. How are you today? Shawn, you just let me know when you kind of want to get started. I think we're getting close. So, to everybody being here, looks like.
If you think everyone's here, let's, or we can wait a couple minutes.
Yeah, we're pretty, let's see. We're pretty good. I don't see Selena on yet, which is interesting. She's usually on by now. I think she might be the only one missing, but Jessica was there. There you go. Yep.
Yeah. I think Selena thought it started at 11 because that was on our shared calendar. So I've been texting her this morning like it's not
Oh,
at
no.
11, but yeah. Anyway, I'll take good notes.
I know. I'm sure you will. So, okay. Well, then I guess we'll go ahead and get started.
Lillian, can you hear now? So it looks like Lillian
Lillian.
Chavez is having trouble with her audio.
Yeah. Can you hear us now, Lillian?
Yeah, I got it.
Perfect. Awesome. Oh, there's Selena. All right, looks like everybody's here then. We're good to go.
Excellent.
Oh, I'm going to undo the video. Just so you guys, at least you know, look at my face anyway.
No problem.
So does everybody see the screen and can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Looks good from here. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Today's presentation is part of the Culture Builds Communities webinar series. This community-based project is designed to help Native communities plan and develop cultural facilities. Culture Builds Communities is a project of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Major funding is provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Museum of the American Indian, and Margaret A. Cargo Philanthropies.
So good morning, good afternoon. I know everyone's in different time zones. My name is Shawn Evans. Again, we met last week. It's great to see everyone again. Melissa, I was not able to figure out how to see the faces in the chat log, so please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Today is the second webinar in the design series of Culture Builds Community. Last week, we spent time with Dee Rendon in Denver, talked about the design process. Today, you have me, and we're going to talk about selecting and working with architects and contractors. And I've tried really hard to make this more interesting than just talking about contracts. And then there'll be four continuing webinars in this design series afterwards, where you'll hear from Dee and I again, as well as from Sam, who's on the call. So I introduced myself last week, but just to kind of give you the soundbite again, I'm an architect in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My firm is Atkin Olshan Shade Architects, or AOS for short. We're a 30-person firm, 27, I guess. We're down a couple. And offices in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The firm is 40 years old, and a great deal of our work is in museums, cultural sites, historic sites, and particularly our New Mexico office. Much of our work is in tribal communities. We've worked with, I think, over 25 different tribal nations across the country, mostly in the Southwest, but throughout the rest of the country as well. And my particular expertise is in historic preservation and museum environments. So I have worked on many collection storage projects, as well as master planning for a variety of museums, including the Oke-Awinge Museum, which is one of the pueblos here in New Mexico. So again, today, we're going to be talking about working with architects and contractors. My email is there. It'll be, again, at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions if we don't have time to get to everything today. I think we should have plenty of time. And I will be providing some documents for Melissa to put on the ATOM website, this Node 440, where there'll be some helpful readings, as well as some what we're calling homework questions, just to help get you prepared for when we do meet up in Oklahoma and we start working with each of you on the concept plans for your individual museums. So the agenda today, we're going to talk about 5 topics. Some are longer than others. We'll start with the discussion of determining the ideal relationship. We'll move on to design and construction approaches. Then we're going to talk about the team. There's many players beyond architects and contractors, and we'll talk about who works for whom and lines of communication. We're going to talk about procurement and contracts. It'll be very thrilling. And we'll end with a discussion of community engagement, and I think particularly with projects in tribal communities and absolutely for museums and cultural centers. This is a critical part of the process. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how the architect in particular can be involved in that. So let's get started. Let's talk about determining the right relationship. So we all have an idea of an architect. It's usually someone who wears funny glasses. It's usually a white dude. And the image of the architect is portrayed by Hollywood and the architectural history books is really that of a solitary genius. But what you're really looking for is a firm with diverse and varied backgrounds and expertise. It takes a tremendous amount of people to do this work. And you really want to make sure that as you find an architect, as you find a firm to work with you, you get a sense for not just the person whose name is on the door, but for the full team of people that work on these projects. So we're trying to figure out who will be your partner and who will help you confirm needs, wants, and aspirations. So I don't prescribe much to the Kevin Costner philosophy, which if you remember the movie Field of Dreams is, if you build it, they will come. That's a very dangerous attitude to have particularly with the tribal museum or cultural center, because a tremendous amount of money is on the line. I prescribe more to Mick Jagger. You can't always get what you need, what you want, but you can get what you need. So in terms of needs, wants, and aspirations, these are going to vary from community to community, of course. Needs might be something as simple as a safe and secure place for our heritage. Wants, a little bit bigger in objectives, might be a place for internal cultural preservation. And aspirations really could be a place to tell our story, provide employment, earn revenue, etc. Again, these are going to be different for each community. It's really important when you start looking for an architect that you have a sense of this. And this is really why you need a strategic plan. And going back to the great webinars that Art gave, and I see he's on the call today. In order for you to find the right partner and someone who's going to help you confirm all these things, you really need that strategic plan so that you have a good sense of where you're heading and you find the right person for the task. So let's talk about the variety of design and construction approaches. One of the first things to keep in mind is that design and construction is often analogous to this idea of a three-legged stool. And the legs are quality, cost, and schedule. Each one of these factors has a relationship to the other two. And you cannot reduce the cost without impacting either the quality or the schedule. You cannot impact the schedule without impacting either quality or cost, and around and around and around you go. We need all three of these, and we need to pay attention. And it's critically important when you're trying to evaluate what design and construction approach you're going to take to keep these in mind, and which of these is most critical to your own situation. More recently, there really is a fourth leg on this stool, and that's sustainability and the idea of green design, being soft on the land, looking at operating expenses, as well as the upfront construction capital expenses, and making sure that we believe very strongly that sustainability, doing right for the planet is just as important as the other three legs. So critically important to start thinking about it. So the traditional approach to construction for many, many years is what we call design, bid, build, and it's really 3 separate phases. Dee talked a little bit about the general phases last week of the design and construction process, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how those relate to the different construction methodologies. So in this approach, you have 2 contracts. The owner would have 2 contracts, one with the architect and one with the general contractor. And I would guess that most of your tribes have procurement policies that mandate a design bid build approach. And we like to push back on that if possible. So just to go through the timeline of these, before you hire an architect or a general contractor, you want to have a budget. And then you hire the architect, and the architect gets going on schematic design. And Dee went through this really well last week. And I have some kind of very generic timelines based on, you know, a kind of a mid-size museum. So we're thinking schematic design, it might last 2 to 3 months. Then we go into design development, another 2 to 4 months. Then construction documents, maybe 3 to 6 months. And then you get into bidding and permitting, which might be 2 to 3 months. And that's when you hire the contractor. Now in between, and then the contractor goes into construction, maybe 12 to 18 months. So we're looking at 21 to 34 months total in this, this kind of generic anticipated timeline. Now along the way, in this methodology, the architect is responsible for developing at least, I would say, 3 estimates, one at the end of schematic design, one at the end of design development, and generally one halfway through construction documents to make sure the project is on budget. But as we'll talk a little bit later on, the architect has no control over construction costs. We have no control over construction schedule. Those are set by the contractor, and there are all sorts of things that can happen in the world, from trade wars to pandemics that can impact cost and schedule. So along the way here, this kind of, Dee used the analogy of Harold and the purple crayon. Here I've got a green crayon representing the cost path throughout the process. So as we start schematic design, we get to the end of our estimate, we may have to go around the block once or twice to refine the project and get the estimate back in alignment with the budget. Same thing in design development, same thing in our 50% construction documents. But if we get to the bidding and permitting, and we get multiple bids from contractors, and something's happened in the world and our estimates are off, we've got to go way back to rework construction documents to bring it back into estimates. So our cost is really in flux, can be in flux in this methodology. So for each of, we're going to look at 2 other construction approaches. And for each, we're going to look at the strengths and risks of each approach. So one of the great things about the traditional approach, design, bid, build, is that we've got a really strong grasp on quality of the project throughout. And that's really what the architect is really ensuring, working with the owner, with the community, to make sure that the quality that you expect at the beginning of the project is what you get at the end. The cost has the potential to start to increase through this, because if you look at that timeline, if you can see through the translucent slide, we could be a year or so out having started before we really have the cost in certainty. And so there is a tendency for cost to escalate. And the schedule is also at risk, I would say, more than the cost, because of this lack of control in cost. And so we may have to go back in time to realign the budget and the cost. So The second design and construction approach I wanted to talk about is design build. And so what's lacking is bid. Now it really becomes sub bidding. We'll talk about that in a minute. So each of these phases now is a little bit shorter than in the design bid build. And so we're looking at a total of about maybe 18 to 26 months for this mid-sized museum or cultural center. This is the fastest of the three methods we'll look at. Now at the beginning of the project, you're hiring the contractor and the architect at one time. It's one contract, typically with the construction manager, and the architect is actually working for the contractor, not you. And so what that means in terms of the money is that the budget is set at the beginning, but it's also certain at the very beginning and it's certain at the end because you've set that in the contract with the contractor. And then the job of the contractor and architect as we move through schematic design, design development, and construction documents is to make sure that the project remains absolutely on budget. And so again, there's a little bit of kind of back and forth, but here rather than cost or schedule, because those are now fairly fixed because your contract is with the contractor from the beginning, who is in control of cost and does have much more control over schedule than the architect. Really, it's the quality that is moving around as we go through the phases of development. So in terms of strengths and risk, here, schedule and cost are very much under control and are most likely to end up where you want them at the end of the project. But quality is at risk of going down because if the cost of materials increases, if the cost of labor increases, unless you have access to additional funds or can keep fundraising and increase the budget and change your contract value with the contractor, we're under a contractual obligation to reduce the quality or perhaps the size of the project and start to eliminate some components of the project to stay on budget and to stay on schedule. Now the third and final approach that we'll look at is a construction manager where you have two contracts, one with the architect and one with the construction manager. And here again, at the beginning of the project, you've set your budget, you've hired the architect, and the architect works on schematic and begins schematic design. And then towards the end of schematic design, then you hire the contractor, and the architect will have already done an estimate of the cost and the contractor will confirm it. And then the architect and the contractor work together throughout this process to make sure you get where you want to be at the end. And this is in terms of overall time, this might be somewhere in the middle, 19 to 28 months. We can shave time off of design development, construction documents, and construction with the contractor early on board. It does mean that the schematic design phase is going to be a little longer because of that early work with the contractor to make sure that our budget is in alignment. So again, we've got estimates throughout. Now our cost is only certain somewhere in the middle of construction documents because that's really when everything is nailed down, and we'll talk about a whole lot of acronyms as we go through this. But the contractor is involved in generating those estimates as well as the architect's professional cost estimator, and you do a process called reconciliation. So this process is really quite excellent for cost control. So there's a little, now here our wavy line is a little bit of time, kind of working back and forth with the contractor, but both the construction manager process and the design bid, the design build process are really designed to help you to prevent all of us from having to go way back, having to start over, having to really revisit. And this is really what we believe is the best approach for getting through the process. Now I've got a note that Jessica raised her hand.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I just wanted to check in regarding the budget. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So on all of these, you start out with budget, and I'm just wondering, do you mean by budget all of the money that you would ever have for the project, or is it a part of the budget that you have now, and maybe then as it develops and you have a design that other people can jump on board with, that you might get additional budget funds? Because from what I've seen, people want to see something, whether it's a drawing or a picture or some sort of really nice looking plan before they're giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to a project.
Absolutely, and that is a great question. So we always talk about construction cost versus project cost. Construction cost is pretty self-explanatory. That's the cost to construct the building. And that construction cost is the value of the contract with your contractor. Outside of construction costs are in what's filling the gap between construction costs and project costs are all the professional fees for the architects and engineers. We'll talk about that in a minute. If you have, if you're requiring kind of legal assistance, property acquisition.
And much more beautiful. It is also different in other ways. The outer likes to lie on its back in the
and there are certainly fixtures, furnishings, and equipment. Your exhibit design costs, your exhibit fabrication and installation costs are probably not in the contractors. Contract exhibit design may be in the architectural fees. So certainly we like to start talking about both construction cost and project cost from the very beginning, because you need to have a handle on both. Ultimately, the contracts that you'll have with your architect and your contractor, or maybe your contractor who has an architect working for them, what is of paramount importance to that, and the only thing that we have control over is the construction cost, but you do need to be looking out for both. So in terms of strengths and risk, as I mentioned before, we believe, and based on my experience and many others in the industry, that the construction manager approach is what is best equipped to help. And there's no guarantees, but it is the best approach to help ensure, to minimize risks, to make sure that your schedule, your cost, and your quality at the end of the project are where you expected them to be when we started this long journey. Now, many tribal procurement policies we see are written and do not allow a construction manager approach. We're seeing that change, but I wanted to talk about, wanted to get back into this schedule and really clarify that. So there's a lot of people who say, well, we can't hire the contractor so early on because they haven't been competitively selected. And a lot of, if you're getting federal funds, a lot of grant, in which most tribal museums and cultural centers are relying on federal funds to a great extent. There certainly are provisions in that grant agreement that all services, including construction, are competitively selected. So you can certainly competitively select the architect, and you can competitively select the contractor early on, and you can talk about fees. And so often what will happen is that in a construction manager approach, and even in a design build approach, the contractor will say that their work is a cost plus fee. And so they're basically saying the cost of the construction is the cost of construction. We'll budget it early on, and their fee might be 10%, it might be 15%, it might be 12%. It's going to depend on the size, complexity of the project. And so you can competitively select. And then as you go through the process, the contractor, even though they've been contracted very early on, once construction documents are complete, and even in the middle of construction documents, they're out in the marketplace, as we say. So they're talking to 3 concrete companies, making sure that they have the best concrete price. They're talking to 3 sheetrockers and 3 mechanical contractors, etc. So there are many ways to convince a procurement department that this is actually in the best interest of your tribe. And one of the things that we want you to start doing through the process, I don't know how many of you have started down this road, is to investigate those procurement policies that your tribe might have. Is this making sense to everyone? Okay, so there's a lot of acronyms that you'll hear, and I just wanted to kind of throw a few out. So CMAR, C-M-A-R, is Construction Manager at Risk, and that goes either really mostly to that last procurement method that we've established, and that we reviewed. And one of the things you'll recall is that I'm suggesting that the construction cost is certain maybe halfway through construction documents, because at this point they've been involved with the project. We've developed our details and scope of the building well enough that they understand the scope, and they can set what's called a GMP at this stage, even though we haven't yet finished the details. Maybe, and so here's GMP, which is a guaranteed maximum price, and that's different than a bid, but that gets into some contractual technicalities that we don't have time to go in. So you may also hear about T&M, which I guess I've animated separately. An RFI is a request for information that can happen during the bidding process, as well as during construction, where the contractor is asking the architect for a clarification. And so the contractor might be saying, I'm not seeing specifically how you want this detail to work, tell me more, or there's a conflict between your drawings and your specifications. An ASI is an architect's supplemental instructions. And so just to kind of go back a minute, at the end of construction documents, you've got a legal set of drawings and specifications that tell the contractor everything they need to know about the building. But I have a secret, and that's that there is no such thing as a perfect set of construction documents, right, Sam? And so during construction, an ASI might need to be released to say, hey, we forgot about this particular detail. Or maybe the owner has changed their mind and wants to change the configuration of a room, or the finish of a wall or a floor. Or the contractor has said, hey, it would be cheaper if we did X, Y, and Z. And so then the architect has to go back and revise the construction drawings and the specifications, because those are contract documents. And then T&M is time and materials. Very, very rarely is a construction contract written with a time and material to determine the cost. Perhaps on a minor renovation where the scope of work is unclear and a contractor has to open up a wall to figure out what's behind, that would be an instance where a construction contract might be time and material. Sometimes a cost event during construction, what we call a change order, would be done as time and material, because it's unclear how long it will take or how many pieces of material are required. Okay, so let's talk about the team and who works for whom. So in most cases, unless you're having a design build approach, we have these 3 separate entities involved in the project: the owner, the architect, and the contractor. Now the owner most likely will have a strategic planner under their contract directly with the owner, a management consultant, an owner's representative, and then a site survey. We architects and contractors really like to see the owners having hired the site surveyor, a hazardous materials investigator, and a geotechnical engineer. A site surveyor they are the people that go out and measure the ground, find the utilities that are either below grade or pole mounted, determine what legal easements might be in place where we can't build. Hazardous materials, this is really much more about if you're renovating an existing building. And everybody needs to make sure that depending on when the building was built, if it was built very recently, this isn't an issue. But we need to know that there's not any asbestos or lead paint. And there are other hazardous materials as well, depending on the history of the project, that the architect needs to know when we start that they're not there. Now, architects are generally not insured to be consulting on hazardous materials. So my insurance policy is at risk if I start to advise clients on hazardous materials. A geotechnical engineer is someone who coordinates what we call a boring, a drilling into the surface of the earth to find where bedrock is, to examine the condition of soils so that the foundations can be designed appropriately. And again, typically those are all under the owner. The architect most often has all these people working for them: a civil engineer, landscape architect, structural engineer, mechanical, plumbing, electrical, fire protection engineer, an acoustician. Maybe there's a separate sustainability consultant. And we certainly always recommend that a professional cost estimator work directly with the architect. Now there's a couple, in museums and cultural centers, there's a couple people that can go either way in terms of who they're working for, and that's interpretive planners and exhibit designers. Now an interpretive planner is someone, they're not designing the exhibit. What they're doing is working with the community or the museum to determine what the educational objectives are for the museum and how those will be conveyed. Is it through exhibits? Is it through programs? Is it through the website? And then the exhibit designer, and sometimes those are the same entity. Sometimes they are different, and a lot of procurement policies are written, like the Smithsonian's policy says that if you do the interpretive plan, you can't design the exhibit. We like to, we recommend that the interpretive planner work for the owner directly, and that the exhibit designer can go either way, but we most often see in projects like this that they work for the architect. In either case, it's much more important for the exhibit designer to have a direct line of coordination with the architect for obvious reasons: lighting, data, and any sort of electrical that the exhibit design might need. The contractor then has all these people working for them: earth movers, demolition, plumbers, concrete, tin knockers, which is a wonderful phrase that I love. That's someone who makes ductwork. Painters, commissioners, that's someone, sometimes those are independent, sometimes they work for the contractor. Usually they actually are independent, and that's someone who is testing the mechanical systems to make sure that they are working correctly. Now, in terms of lines of communication, really we want that line of communication to be at the top, that the owner and the architect communicate. The architect and the contractor are obviously in a lot of communication. And sometimes the owner and the contractor have very little communication, and the architect is working as we call as the agent for the owner. But sometimes that it is a triangle, and that just depends on all sorts of factors, and the sophistication and experience of the owner with construction projects. Sometimes that the owner's representative would play a stronger role. What we want to minimize is the extent to which the owner is directing the mechanical engineer or the architect should not be communicating directly with the painters. Similarly, the contractor shouldn't be talking with the sustainability consultant independently, because each one of these people at the top, the owner, the architect, and the contractor, these are the parties that have contractual relationships with one another, and they have contractual relationships with the people below them. But it gets to be very challenging, and it can be a real risk for cost and schedule if people start communicating with blindly with the people under someone else's contract. Now that in the age of email and Zoom and all of those things, of course, it's ideal for everyone to be communicating at the same time. But what we really want to make sure is that no one is giving direction to someone that is not underneath their contract. Okay, so that is a good segue into procurement and contracts. I have this image of a wampum belt, a contract which sadly weren't treaties and contracts have not a great history with tribal nations, and so we really want to make sure that you're focused on making sure that this contract is actually working for you. So we're going to first talk about what to look for in your architect and contractor. So you want to find someone, and this applies equally to architects and contractors. You want to find someone with similar experience, someone who is creative. And typically we think of architects as the creative ones, but contractors are every bit as creative and experts at problem solving. You want to understand the approach that both the architect and the contractor bring, their sensitivity. This is really important in tribal projects. There are boundaries of traditional knowledge. There are boundaries in the calendar that can't be crossed. And you need to make sure that both your architect and your contractor understand that, and that when a cultural event happens and construction needs to cease, or you may not be able to meet for a period of 3 weeks because of traditional doings, that needs to be understood by these parties. Obviously, proximity and familiarity with your region, with your tribe, with your place is ideal. You want to make sure that your architect and your contractor have proven, demonstrated experience at meeting budgets and schedules. Something is great is experience with grants. Myself and my office do end up assisting our clients a lot with grant writing. We are not grant writers, but we do have our finger on the pulse of some funding availabilities. And something that is, of course, important in tribal communities is Native preference. And while I personally am not Native American, and my firm is not Native owned, we do understand that it is to everyone's benefit that you hire a Native architect if there's one in your region that does provide you with all of these other capabilities. If not, then look elsewhere, but start by looking in Native communities. And this is also a great way of building the capacity of Native companies to provide these services. So what's the most important thing that you're looking for? What's most important to your community? It might be the things that are there in bold blue: similar experience, approach, sensitivity, budget, and schedule. It might be proximity and familiarity. Each community is going to determine this separately. And you want to make sure to structure your procurement to aid you in comparing each firm apples to apples. Your procurement department may never have written an RFP or an RFQ for an architect. professional services for architecture and design are very different than buying a chiller for the tribal administration building. And so you want to make sure that you're, as the museum, as the committee or employees of a museum and cultural center, make sure that your procurement company, your procurement department, or whoever's writing the RFP, RFQ, and the contract understands the issues that are of critical importance to your museum and cultural center. Remember that this is going to be a long-term relationship. The schedules that I showed before were, 2 to 3 years, but this might be 5 to 10 years. Maybe it's a phased project, and you really want to choose someone that you're going to enjoy spending time with, because you're going to spend a lot of time with us. And then something that is interesting that we like to think about a lot is, do you want a firm that's done this many, many times? Or do you want someone who's going to develop a truly unique representation of your culture? And so often what we find is that clients say, well, we want an architect who's done exactly what we're envisioning. And they've envisioned something that's so unique that nobody's done it. And it makes it hard to do that. I think there's as much value in finding someone that maybe hasn't done exactly what you're imagining, because they're going to have to work even harder, and the communication between you and that architectural firm is going to have to be really great. So it's a good quality control check. Obviously, it's a little unintuitive, but we certainly have found it to be true in our experience. So you want to make sure technically that you're finding someone who is experienced with developing an architecture that ensures preservation of your heritage. Museums are very technical buildings. Cultural centers less so, but particularly if this is a place of collections, you want to make sure that your architect knows how to do this. But it's not just technical. It's making sure that team can meet your strategic programming goals for an impactful experience. So what's the methodology for hiring a firm? You've probably heard a lot of these RFQs and RFPs. So let's drill into this a little bit. A request for qualifications might be the first step of the process. It might be the only step in the process. And typically what we see as architects responding to requests for qualifications is that we're having to restate our understanding of the project. This ensures that you're getting someone who understands what you need. But you also probably want to, so that's what. You also want to understand how. How are each firm that you're looking at going to work with you? What's their decision-making process? And how are they incorporating community engagement? Of course, there's a lot of other things that we do that would be described in a how section. But I believe that for tribal projects, these are the two most important parts of our approach. You want to understand their team, both the internal staff of the architect's office, but also all those other people, the engineers, the landscape architects, the cost estimators, etc. Critically important is understanding their relevant experience. And you want to make sure that they're providing you some visuals of what these places look like so that you can get a sense of the quality. Have them provide you a narrative description and have them tell you how it's relevant to what your needs are. Have them tell you a bit about the cost and the schedule of each of these projects, and make sure that they give you a reference. And I know it's a pain and it takes a lot of time, but it's really important that you call those references. Now, most architects won't give you a reference that won't give them a glowing recommendation, but make sure that you call them anyways. And again, of course, native experience and preference. One thing that we see often with native preference is that it's an all or nothing thing. Usually, you might get 5 or 10 extra points in the process if the firm is native owned. But we also like to see policies that are a bit more open than that. I have two native architects on staff right now who are very involved, folks that know Sam well, that are involved with the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers. And so there are many ways to evaluate preference, but obviously native owned company, it would be preferred. Now, a request for proposal might be the first step. If it's the first step, it would include everything we've just discussed under RFQs, but you would also make sure to get a detailed schedule and a fee proposal. So we sometimes see tribes and agencies hiring solely based on qualifications. They don't want to talk to us about fees. They want to make sure they've got the right person who's got the right qualifications. It's rare that that's the case, but it sometimes is. Here in the state of New Mexico, there are many types of projects, many types of public projects that are required by statute to hire solely on the basis of qualifications. And that's because there are formulas that are already established for fees or general rules of thumb, and they'll negotiate a fee with the architect following selection based on RFQ. But we typically do see RFP right off the bat. Sometimes it's a staged process, where if you're legally obligated to advertise, you might just say, well, let's issue a request for qualifications first, and you might get 20 responses. Then you can shortlist and ask the 3 most qualified for their fees. And that way you're making sure that you're not creating a situation where you're having to reject someone who's given you a very, very low fee but isn't qualified for the project. And then interview is a critical part of the process. Sometimes clients and agencies want to be able to select right off of the proposal, but you are not buying toilet paper. And as challenging as that might be right now, it's not usually, and you want to make sure that you have the ability to sit in the same room or Zoom call, and make sure that the person you're wanting to hire understands your needs. See how they present themselves. How well do they listen? That's critically important. How do they respond to questions? These are hard things to gauge in a written proposal, but you're looking to spend a lot of time with these people. And so you want to understand how they work as a team and really try to figure out, are they going to be your partner? And what's the chemistry like? Something we get asked about from time to time is the idea of competitions, where you're asking architects for preliminary designs as part of the process. We firmly believe this is not a good idea. And it's not because we don't volunteer. We do, and we do pro bono work quite frequently. But when you're selecting someone based on a competition, you really need to recognize that design is developed in a vacuum. It's often irrespective of cost, and usually it's without community values. So then you're going to end up with something flashy and beautiful, but ultimately hasn't been generated based on a detailed understanding of your needs. And then you're always working against this preconceived notion. You're paying the architect to develop the design, to develop the program and according to your budget, your needs, your aspirations, etc. So no matter which process you use, please make sure to make it fair, recorded, and transparent, because it will need to be defended most likely. People will ask you, how did you choose this person? And you want to be able to say, this is how we did it. We developed a point scoring methodology. They were able to get 20 points for approach, 15 points for fee, et cetera, et cetera. and your procurement departments will most likely be experienced with helping set those point systems. So types of contracts. Well, there are many. I just wanted to talk briefly about the 3 types of contracts that we see. Often we see standard contracts coming from a tribe. The challenge with those is that often they're not set up specifically for professional services. So we end up spending a lot of time going through and trying to strike sections of a contract that have nothing to do with architectural services. And your professional service contract really should be different from your construction contract. Now you may hear a lot about AIA contracts. AIA is the American Institute of Architects. That's the professional organization that's established to serve architects. And they have become the kind of the preeminent authority in developing standardized contracts, both for architects and for contractors. Now they're being generated by the AIA, so a lot of people believe, well, then clearly if they're made by the AIA, they've been written to the benefit of the architects. That's generally proven not to be the case. They're quite balanced. The A series of contracts are the owner-contractor agreement. There are different ones for, there's going to be a very different contract if you're doing the design bid build, the design build, or the construction manager. And so you need to make sure that those are aligned. The owner-architect agreements are the B series. And you can modify the language in these contracts. So if there's things that are particularly, that your community finds egregious, they can be revised. And we certainly encourage all of our clients to utilize legal counsel. We certainly do as we evaluate contracts. Now there are also letter contracts that might just be a few pages long. It sounds like a really great idea because it's not a 50, 100-page document that's really complicated and nobody can understand. Letter contracts are probably okay for feasibility studies, but certainly not recommended for full services because the responsibilities of each party are not defined very well. It's very limited, and there's limited guidance when things go wrong. Obviously, everyone hopes that nothing goes wrong and everything goes according to plan through a contract. But the bulk of a contract is really there to protect the various parties when things go wrong. So there's a pre-agreed upon process for determining how you're going to address that issue when something goes wrong, whether that's cost or schedule or what have you. So again, contracts are there to define scope, process, and responsibilities, help prevent things from going wrong. And a good contract is balanced and protects both parties. What we often see is lawyers get involved and write contracts that benefit the owner or the architect or the contractor. And that really, what we find is that wastes a whole lot of time because they're really important documents and we have to make sure that they're fair and balanced. So what is the owner looking for in a contract? Obviously, they're looking for protection for schedule and budget. Who pays for redesign if it's not at budget? That's going to be really important to the owner. And dispute resolution. Again, when something goes wrong, how are we going to figure out in a way that protects the owner's interests? Some issues that might be a little less important are a clear point of contact with the architect's office or the contractor. Who's calling the shots? Who do I need to contact if something's not going the way that I like? The court of jurisdiction. Obviously, with a tribal project, we certainly see that most contracts are written clearly to state that the court of law is the tribal court. And indemnification is something that owners are often very concerned about. Indemnification is basically a fancy way of saying who's got your back. If I, as the architect, make a mistake in our design, or if the contractor makes a mistake in building something, and somebody gets sued, The owner wants to make sure that if it's the architect's fault, that the architect is going to protect the owner because it was not their responsibility. They're also going to be, owners going to be looking for fees, changes to cost of work. How does that happen? Process of assignment. What happens if the architectural company goes out of business? What happens if one of their sub-consultants goes out of business? What's the process for dealing with that? You want to make sure the insurance is set up. There's a concept of the initial decision maker, and that's in construction, who gets to decide that this version of this type of carpet is equivalent to that type of carpet. There are many decisions that have to be made. Other issues are liquidated damages, which is a curious phrase that means if the construction is late, the contractor might have to pay $500 a day or $5,000 a week or something. And then ownership of documents. Typically the architect's plans and specs, the architect wants to own those. And sometimes the owner wants to own those. So it's something to think through. The architect is also going to be looking at schedule and budget and dispute resolution. More important to the architect are typically a clear point of contact. We want to make sure that we are only legally obligated to receive directions from one particular person, or maybe it's 2 or 3 people from the owner, to make sure that that someone from tribal council doesn't call and say, hey, you've got to change this, and we haven't heard from our contact and the owner. And just part of a clear communication strategy. Ownership of documents I talked about. The architect is going to be looking for mutual indemnification, which says, hey, you're right, if I screw this up, it's on me and I will protect you, but you also have roles and responsibilities. And if you're negligent, if the owner is negligent on some issue related to the museum, they also have to protect the architect. So that's often something that there's a little bit of back and forth in contract negotiation. The architect is going to be looking for adjustable fees and additional services, because sometimes the scope isn't known at the beginning, the budget might be known, and that we need to make sure that we have the ability to ask for more money if our services need to change. We're also looking for protection from unforeseen conditions, particularly in an existing building. If we had no way of knowing that there was something behind the walls or under a floor, that we can't be forced to deal with that without fair compensation. How changes to the cost of work are going to be established. Standard of care is an interesting phrase in contracts. And that basically says that the architect isn't perfect, and the architect isn't going to chase down every possible detail or scenario that might come up. And there's a legal phrase called the standard of care, which basically says there is a standard that is generally understood that an architect's services will apply to. So that's what our architect's going to be looking for. We also like to make sure that there is language in the contracts that recognize, as I said earlier, that we're not in control of construction costs. We're also going to be looking for insurance. All these same issues everyone's looking at, but they're of varying importance to the different parties. Process of assignment is something obviously we're hoping we don't go out of business, so we're not that concerned about. Contractor is going to be looking for these things. We've talked about them. Payment procedures is going to be really important to the contractor, because there's generally millions of dollars in play, and the contractor in many ways is acting like a bank. They're loaning you money every month because they're paying a tremendous amount of money out of pocket to pay for materials, to pay for labor, and establishing the way in which they're repaid for that every month is something that is critically important to figure out. They're going to be very interested in liquidated damages, how those are phrased, who gets to decide, again, if the project is late, other things, and I think you kind of get the idea. The contractor is also going to be very interested in the responsibilities of the architect, and that's something that is defined, and that the contracts between the owner and the architect and the contract between the owner and the contractor, they need to be coordinated so that those responsibilities are squared away, because the architect generally does not have any contractual relationship with the contractor, but we do have critical responsibilities that have to be met. Otherwise, costs are at risk, schedule is at risk. And so the contractors wanting to make sure that your contract with the architect is appropriately configured. Contractor is less concerned about mutual indemnification. So fees, this is specific to architects' professional fees. How are they set? We generally see there are 3 different ways: lump sum, hourly, or percentage-based contract. A lump sum contract hopefully says for schematic design, our fee is $25,000, and design development might be $30,000, but it's set by phase. We want to understand how it's calculated, and again, how it gets adjusted as services change, if they change. Often we see clients wanting an hourly contract, hourly fees, with the idea that this is going to keep costs down, but it's very hard to control, requires an extraordinary amount of time to keep good records about who's doing what for what issue, and it's very hard to limit. Sometimes we're requested to do an hourly NTE, or not to exceed, which we're generally okay with, although very rarely do we not exceed those. But then your interest is protected. A percentage-based contract is one where the fee is set as a percentage of the construction cost, and that range depends on the cost and complexity of the project. So a higher cost or lower complexity project is going to have a lower percentage. A lower cost or higher complexity project is going to have a higher percentage. And it could range between 6% for a very straightforward, very large project, and 15 and maybe even 20% for very complex or very small projects. And there's always this idea that this doesn't make sense because the architect benefits from cost increases. So how are they looking out for our interest? And that's something that's important to clarify in your contract, because we obviously have an interest in making sure that your budget is protected and that you're happy with our services. So we certainly are looking to remain on budget and on schedule. This is the last section of the project, and so I wanted to make sure that we got some images in, not just bore you with dry text. Community engagement is a critical part of any architectural project, but particularly for tribal projects and museums and cultural centers. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about that and how you want to make sure that your architect is involved in that. What we see, what we love to see in projects like this are community events. We love to help organize walks so that we can understand the community both from a physical perspective and a cultural perspective. What are the things that the community holds dear as we walk around? The picture on the lower left is me kind of leading a tour at Cochiti Pueblo, and we're looking at historic photographs, and we're having an incredible conversation about the change that happened through time at this community. The images on the right are from Santo Domingo Pueblo, or Kiwa Pueblo, as they've recently renamed themselves or gone back to their ancestral name. And here we did a 2-mile community walk from the traditional village to the site of a new housing project that we designed. And it allowed us to really understand the landscape, view sheds, key features, And also to have, we need to have conversations about boundaries of traditional knowledge and what's reasonable for us to know and what we shouldn't know. And that's something that's very challenging, but very rewarding for us to be trusted and to engage in those conversations. In the middle, we always like to make sure that we're thinking intergenerationally with engagement. We love to incorporate kids. They have extraordinary imaginations and can see things that no one else can see. But we also want to make sure that we're including the elders because they have extraordinary wisdom into their place ultimately, and that's what a museum and cultural center about is place. Again, on the left, pictures engagement with elders and youth. This is from a cultural preservation project at Okewinge, where we ran a tribal education program for 5 summers with high school youth from the community who helped us measure buildings, go through historic photographs, video, and transcribe oral histories with elders. And then there's lots and lots of meetings that will happen with community engagement. And so that's one of the real important reasons why you want to interview your architect. Make sure that they can have that they're good listeners, as I said. Make sure that they can lead a conversation, that they're able to gain the wisdom that your people have to offer. But those conversations may also need to be one-on-one. They may need to be meetings. And so you need to make sure that the architect has the social skills to do that. Obviously, those types of engagement efforts shouldn't be just the architect running around the community talking to people. And so you'll have to have people on your side of the table that help develop the process according to your tribal protocols. One of the things that we like to do to understand place is exercises where community members, this is happens to be a campus master plan that we developed, but is just as relevant in a tribal community, is having them describe their place to us graphically through colored stickers, which mean different things. And then for this project, we developed this very interesting idea. We created this table, which are the pictures on the top and the right, which allowed it was kind of a low-tech tool of seeing before and after, asking questions, and making sure that the stakeholders, the community members, could stand around and have a conversation with each other. And we were just kind of in the background listening. That's a really interesting way. Obviously, there are many high-tech ways to gain feedback, but we really prefer these low-tech methods. The use of models and drawings, not just to show and ask for applause, but really to receive constructive criticism, to make sure that as we go through the process, that the architect has heard what you've said, and to make sure, most importantly, that we've acted on what you said. And a design is an iterative process. I think Dee talked well about this in his presentation, that it's a back and forth, and we test things out and bring them back to you to make sure that they're meeting your needs. Charrettes are a great process where we work with community members and draw with colored pencils and sketching and testing out ideas with you and encouraging you to draw with us, so that make sure that we're finding the balance between needs and aspirations. And then ultimately, this is, we're generating ideas to create real places, and that as we go through the process, maybe we're starting with wood blocks there in the middle as a program we did with children on a housing project in Santa Fe, where we engaged children and taught them how to shape space with buildings and how to create equity through the arrangement of buildings. But again, it's iterative, and we'll be back and forth, and bring you all the steps of the way. We don't kind of come in for the initial engagement, go away, and then bring it back to you when we're all done. That we need to see you many, many times. Ultimately, here a rendering of our design we developed for the Okewingi Museum here in New Mexico. We're trying to develop a design for a design that is yours, that represents your community, that achieves your educational and programmatic goals, and can be built to your budget and your schedule. And we want to come back and be proud of the facility and really think of it as a collaborative effort. But we want these facilities to be unique. We want them to represent your values first and foremost. I believe that is my last slide. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we've got a little bit of time for questions. Did that make sense? Was that helpful?
I'll add in a little bit, Shawn.
Please.
It may sound daunting, all that we just went through. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that
There's
talk
a
about
lot.
contracts and the stakes and lawyers and all this. But really, a lot of what he talked is from a time standpoint, a small part of the whole process. It's getting the contract, and usually there's, your lawyers, our lawyers, or something involved. And we try to make it as easy as possible for you. So to describe it in that, it was incredibly helpful in kind of the long format, but don't let it feel daunting and unattainable or unachievable, because we do make it easy for you. And the process really goes, most of the time really smoothly.
Hi, I have a question. This is Jessica with Chickman Village. Hi. So with this program, are we hoping to get to some point in what was just described by the end of our time with you? Or is that kind of a gray area where some of our tribes may go a long way and others of us be not quite so far by the end of this?
So the way that this program has been established is that, we're in this preliminary education phase where we're kind of teaching you some of the things that we've learned through our experience in these types of projects. And then as we understand it, we're going to help develop some conceptual plans for these types of facilities for you. That would be a great tool, a great resource for then you to begin the procurement process, and so that you have something to bring to an architect and say, this is generally what we're looking for. And that will be a huge asset to your process. It will ideally save time and money. But one of the challenges is that we are doing this because we're not contracted with you. We're not going to be able to develop 9 separate museum designs. We're going to kind of learn from each other, and kind of it's really a kind of a testing of the process. So my concern is that we want to make sure that your expectations of what you'll get at the end are clear, and that we're not going to be able to design buildings to a specific budget. Certainly not, for a specific site, but it will certainly give you a tremendous leg up as you move forward with your individual projects. And I'm sure if you want to sign a contract, Dee or Sam or I would be happy to do that.
I think from my understanding, I think what I would hope that you guys would get out of this is that once this is all over, you're equipped with the knowledge of the process, and you have done enough of the pre-work to be able to then start all this all over from scratch from the beginning. Because at the end of this, you're going to have to work with your community, work with your leadership to do a lot of stuff that that you guys need to do before you even get to the design phases of this. Oftentimes, when we get in the RFP, which we kind of talked about as the first part of the process we talked about today, there's been months or maybe years of work done before we're even involved. And so we're here because we know what happens down the road, and we can help you guys understand the best way to set up that scenario so that once you're about to work with an architect, and it could be a local person, I would reiterate that there are plenty of native architects in your region that can help you. But we're trying to get you off to the best start possible with your design project.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, what I see a lot is that we get an RFP. I've got one on my desk right now. And clearly the community has not thought through these issues yet. And so it is a real risk for success. And so I think, you know, just to kind of reiterate what Sam is saying, we want to make sure that this is setting you up for success.
I'd like to add too, Shawn, fantastic presentation. A lot of what you're developing here is a process, but today we're talking about a relationship. And the more you can get to know the people you're interviewing, the architects, the contractors, you're going to spend some time with them. And the more you can research how they've worked in the past with other communities or how their projects have fared from budget, from schedule, some of the issues, it's kind of doing an overall check. But a lot of times as architects, we even say amongst ourselves is a lot of times when we interview, it's not about maybe who we are, but it's how we relate. You'll relate to some people better than others and some teams differently than others. So I would encourage you to make that interview process very important, from the history of the firm to just how you feel when you meet with somebody. It's a relationship and it's a process that you're going to go through.
Great, that was great. Thank you. Any other questions?
So we move to the quiz.
Quiz.
Okay.
Don't make them nervous.
Rapid fire acronyms.
Right, exactly. All right. If we don't have any other questions, then, you know, thank you very much, Shawn, for your wonderful presentation today.
Thank you.
I will.
I was going to say, so next week you have me again, and we're going to talk about programming, which really gets into the spaces that are required in your museum or cultural center, and really how to balance, again, needs, wants, and ambitions.
Hey, this is Jessica. I have one additional question, and maybe it will come up you know, in next week's presentation or just in general, but all of our staff members, Selena and myself, are grant funded. And so we don't have the luxury of just indefinite staff members that can just work on projects forever and ever.
Right.
So I'm wondering, I mean, hopefully we continue to get funding for each of our positions, but how long, in terms of all that strategic planning and design contract work that we're hoping that we can all accomplish in the next you know, year or two with guidance from this program, how long should we anticipate having a staff member dedicated to having these community meetings and kind of doing all that prep work, so that maybe now Selena and I can be working toward writing that into our work plans and asking for money from different sources to help ensure that we do have a staff member or multiple staff members continuing to work on this. I don't know if you have an answer for that, but it comes to mind as a concern that if we don't have continuity, we're not going to get anywhere.
Right. That's a great question. I think, you know, it could be, I mean, it could be we so often, you know, like this RFP I've got on my desk, I would have been thrilled if they would have spent 2 or 3 months working on some of these strategic issues beforehand. That would be great. You could spend 2 years. It seems a little excessive. A lot of that depends on your community. Depends on, you know, the density of your community. Obviously, you know, planning a facility for the Dene, whose tribal lands are expansive, it requires a lot more work and time than a smaller, tight community where things can be done more quickly. And it goes, you know, a lot of that, I think a lot of it, in an ideal world, should be done before, but we don't live in an ideal world. We recognize that. And if as long as those conversations, they can overlap to some extent with the early phases of design. But again, it's risk, and you're risking kind of having to start over and go backwards. And we want to make sure that we're design is always a dance. It's always a little bit of forward and a little bit of backwards, but ultimately we want it to be a lot more forwards and as minimal backwards as possible. But we have to test things. We have to go back and forth. So we also understand that staff members are grant funded, and we may not have the same people from throughout the process. And I think, you know, one of your best bets to guard yourselves and your interest in those situations is to really document well your planning processes, and make sure that you're getting tribal resolutions along the way, so that the goals of the project are protected and are not being revisited time and time again. That's critical.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
All right. Any other questions? No. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll be sending out an email with any links to resources that Shawn has. And other than that, we will see you next Wednesday. Take care.
Well, thank you all very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. See you next week.